August 9th, 1942. In the pre-dawn darkness off Guadalcanal, 4 Allied heavy cruisers erupted into towering columns of flame. Japanese torpedo strikes tore through their hulls with surgical precision, yet not a single American sailor had seen the enemy coming. In just 37 minutes, over 1,000 men died in what would become the US Navy's worst defeat in combat. The Americans possessed radar, they had numerical superiority, and they were slaughtered anyway. The question haunting every surviving officer was simple: how do you fight an enemy you cannot see? At this point in the Pacific War, the Imperial Japanese Navy owned the night. For decades, they'd trained specifically for nocturnal warfare, selecting lookouts with exceptional night vision and equipping them with enormous pedestal-mounted binoculars. Their strategy was deliberate. They knew American industry would eventually outproduce them in daylight battles, so they'd mastered the darkness. And they possessed a weapon that made this mastery lethal: the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo. Unlike American torpedoes that left visible trails, the Long Lance used pure oxygen fuel, creating almost no wake. It could strike from 20,000 yards away, miles beyond visual range, delivering devastating blows from an invisible enemy. Japanese destroyers would fire spreads of these weapons in the dark, then vanish before American gunners even knew they were under attack. Among the shaken American commanders analyzing the Savo Island massacre was Admiral Chester Nimitz. The numbers were brutal. 4,911 American sailors would die at sea during the Guadalcanal campaign, 3 times the Marine casualties on land. But buried in the disaster reports was a curious detail. The cruiser USS Helena had detected the Japanese force early with something called an SG radar. The operators saw the enemy clearly on their screens, yet chaos in the command structure meant no one acted on the information until it was too late. Nimitz began asking, what if the technology wasn't the problem? What if it was how we were using it? The Japanese had spent 40 years perfecting their methods. American radar was so new that most captains didn't trust it, but somewhere in the wreckage of those early defeats lay the blueprint for a revolution, one that would transform hunters into prey and render decades of Japanese training obsolete. The question was no longer, could radar work? It was, could the US Navy learn fast enough to survive? October 1942. American ships still died in the dark waters of Iron Bottom Sound. Early radar sets like the CXAM operated at long wavelengths, painting targets as blurry blobs on primitive displays. Operators couldn't distinguish a destroyer from a rain squall. Sea clutter obscured contacts, and even when radar detected something, the information was scattered, one officer monitoring the scope, another at the helm, the captain on the bridge, none talking to each other fast enough. The Japanese, meanwhile, continued their lethal work with confidence. Why fear an enemy who couldn't see, couldn't coordinate, and couldn't shoot straight in the dark? But in laboratories back home, engineers at MIT's radiation laboratory had cracked a critical problem. They developed the SG radar, a microwave system operating at 3 gigahertz with a 10-centimeter wavelength. The technical leap sounds modest. The tactical impact was revolutionary. The SG could resolve individual targets at 22 miles. More importantly, it featured something called a plan position indicator display, a circular screen showing contacts as bright points on a map-like grid with the ship at the center. For the first time, a radar operator could see the tactical situation the way a captain needed to understand it. Who was where, moving in what direction, at what range. It was like giving a blind boxer perfect vision. But having eyes wasn't enough. The institutional resistance was fierce. Captains trained in visual gunnery doctrine didn't trust glowing green screens when their lives were on the line. Even with the SG installed, American forces operated incoherently. Radar operators working in isolation, information arriving too slowly, commanders reverting to visual tactics under pressure. The core problem became clear. Radar provided data, but the Navy had no system to transform that data into decisions. In the chaos of battle, with shells screaming overhead and damage reports flooding in, how could a captain synthesize radar contacts, sonar readings, radio intelligence, and visual reports fast enough to act? The answer came from the Guadalcanal crucible itself. In late 1942, the Navy created something unprecedented, the Combat Information Center. The CIC centralized all information sources in one dedicated room, staffed by specially trained officers who maintained a master tactical plot. It was the brain connecting to radar's eye. Training schools opened in early 1943 to teach this new doctrine. But doctrine meant nothing without proof. The Japanese still ruled the night, and soon they'd arrive with a battleship to bombard Henderson Field into rubble, the airbase that controlled the entire campaign. Admiral Willis Lee, commanding the battleship USS Washington, would get one chance to prove the system worked. If he failed, Guadalcanal, and possibly the entire Pacific offensive, would fail with him. November 15, 1942, just after midnight. Vice Admiral Kondo's task force closed on Guadalcanal, the battleship Kirishima at its center. Their mission: destroy the American airbase and win the campaign. Opposing them was Lee's Task Force 64, 2 battleships against a superior Japanese force expert in night combat. The engagement began catastrophically. Lee's second battleship, USS South Dakota, suffered electrical failures. Japanese guns found her, and within minutes she was ablaze, radar knocked out, radio dead. The Japanese concentrated their fire, illuminating her with searchlights. And in that moment of seeming victory, they made a fatal mistake. 9,000 yards away, shrouded in darkness, USS Washington's SG radar tracked every Japanese ship with crystalline clarity. The plot in the Combat Information Center showed range, bearing, and speed for each target. The Japanese, fixated on the burning South Dakota, never saw Washington approaching. Lee's fire control officers fed radar data directly into the gun directors. The massive 16-inch rifles swung onto target, a target the gunners themselves could not physically see. At 0 hours, Washington opened fire. The first salvo struck Kirishima amidships. The second destroyed her bridge. In 7 minutes of radar-directed gunnery, Washington landed 9 16-inch shells and 45-inch shells. The Japanese battleship's topside erupted into flames. Her steering gear shattered. Fires raged out of control. The Kirishima's lookouts never saw the ship that killed them. Their superior night vision, their decades of training, their tactical doctrine, none of it mattered against an enemy that could see through darkness itself. At 3:20, the battleship capsized and sank northwest of Savo Island. Admiral Lee's after-action report was unambiguous. Our margin of superiority was due almost entirely to our possession of radar. The battle shattered more than a battleship. It broke the psychological foundation of Japanese naval strategy. Their night-fighting superiority, the tactical edge they'd spent 40 years developing to counter American industrial might, vanished in a single engagement. The darkness that had been their domain became their death sentence. By 1943, U.S. destroyers equipped with SG radar and trained in CIC doctrine achieved kill ratios of 11.8 to 1 against Japanese forces in night actions. Battles at Vela Gulf, Empress Augusta Bay, and Cape St. George became one-sided massacres, American ships picking off Japanese vessels that never saw them coming. The long-lance torpedo, once invisible and unstoppable, became irrelevant when its targets could track launch positions from beyond visual range and maneuver before the torpedoes arrived. Japanese commanders, once confident, now feared night surface actions. The invisible weapon wasn't the radar itself, it was the transformation it enabled, turning electronic signals into tactical awareness, awareness into coordinated action, action into complete dominance. In the span of 3 months, the US Navy had learned what the Japanese spent 4 decades perfecting, then rendered all of it obsolete with a 10-centimeter wavelength and a glowing green screen. The hunters had become the hunted, and they never saw it coming.